The Blade trilogy may remain a beloved piece of superhero movie history, but rewatching the films brings some harsh truths about them to light. Overall, the Blade trilogy has aged well and remains an interesting entry in early modern superhero movies. Some elements of the films haven't aged as gracefully as others. Most notably, some special effects sequences stand out as products of their times. It's unfortunate that the final Blade trilogy movie is easily the weakest, ending a strong and important franchise on a sour note. Marvel's Blade trilogy brought the titular Daywalker to life on the big screen, but rewatching the three-film arc highlights a few harsh realities about the movies. Before the advent of the shared cinematic universe and the movies of the MCU, Marvel Studios had a number of separately successful movies based on characters from the pages of their comics. 1998's Blade began a popular trilogy that chronicled the struggles of the titular vampire hunter as he faced various blood-sucking monsters in his crusade to protect humanity. Though the movies rightfully remain beloved, not every aspect of them has aged well. Sadly, as the superhero movie genre has moved on considerably since the late 1990s and early 2000s, there are elements of the Blade trilogy that now seem unimpressive or cliched. What's more, with Marvel's upcoming MCU Blade movie promising to bring the character into the modern era of superhero cinema, certain facts about the previous Blade movies become considerably clearer. Although the three-film arc certainly played an important role in introducing the vampire hunter to a wider audience and helping superhero movies enter the mainstream, the trilogy was hardly perfect. Here are 10 harsh realities of rewatching the Blade trilogy. When it comes to iconic or particularly impressive scenes in the Blade trilogy, few stand out as clearly as the first film's blood rave. The scene sees a vampire lure an unwitting human to an underground rave in a meatpacking facility, only for Blade to enter and save his life. It's an exceptionally well-presented piece of cinema, but it's actually the first scene in the entire trilogy. The best-remembered scene in the whole three-film saga being the very first isn't ideal, but it's all too evident upon rewatching the trilogy. One of the biggest issues with the Blade trilogy is actually a common criticism of more modern superhero movies, too. It has a big problem with its villains. Deacon Frost, the villain of the first film, is a delightfully evil and self-assured antagonist. However, Blade II's villain is much less memorable, and Blade, Trinity's is perhaps the dullest character in the entire trilogy. In fact, each of the three movies boasts more interesting secondary villains, with Donal Logue, Ron Perlman, and Paul Triple H Levesque, respectively, stealing the show in each movie. Though the Blade trilogy paints a dark and bleak picture of the hero's crusade against an ever-swelling horde of vampires, it does feature a handful of funnier moments. Unfortunately, the trilogy's more humorous scenes don't appear to be intentional. Scenes such as Blade's Deacon Frost coating himself in sunscreen to walk around in the day and Blade, Trinity's bizarre assertion about the hero's arousal regarding blood complete with an unnecessary shot of Snipes' crotch stand out as strange and tonally dissonant, only serving to hurt the trilogy overall in spite of their bizarre hilarity. The Blade trilogy features many actors, but few of its supporting characters are as memorable as Hannibal King in Blade, Trinity. Played by Ryan Reynolds, the levity that Hannibal brings to the film and the wider trilogy is much needed, although it was actually subtly damaging for the three movies. Reynolds' natural charm meant that he entirely eclipsed Snipes' performance as the titular hero, effectively rendering the entire film somewhat lopsided. Ryan Reynolds' undeniable screen presence was one of the film's best features, but overall, it might have caused more problems than it solved. Though it's not explicitly negative, one of the harshest realities of the Blade trilogy is that the movies never made any earnest attempt to be accurate to the comics. This has its benefits, as the character of Whistler was an entirely new creation for the movies, offering a mentor figure to Wesley Snipes' Blade. However, in its creation of new characters and amalgamations of others, the Blade trilogy isn't as true to the character's initial roots as intended. Though the trilogy came to define the character's future, the deviation from the source material occasionally leaves its narratives feeling somewhat directionless. Considering the Blade trilogy is over 20 years old, it has aged remarkably well in many ways. Its visuals are not one of them, however, as its use of CGI has significantly dated the movies. The first film, in particular, makes extensive use of computer-generated effects, and though they were passable at the time, they look pretty awful upon a modern rewatch. It's a shame, as these poorly aged visual effects are one of the few elements that break the film's immersion, with most other aspects holding up far better by comparison. Though the impressively choreographed action sequences of the Blade trilogy remain a clear high point, they also highlight an unpleasant truth about modern superhero movies. The level of violence on display in the trilogy only serves to underline how much tamer the superhero genre has grown and that, in many cases, this should be considered a missed opportunity. Some superhero stories, such as Blade's, deserve to feature a much darker and more brutal style of action, but that's something that the genre has all but lost in the years since the Blade trilogy's conclusion. Chris Christopherson's Whistler was one of the Blade trilogy's best innovations. His role as Blade's mentor in the first movie is perfect and offers an appropriate level of context to his ability to keep up the fight against the vampires. Upon rewatching the trilogy, however, it's clear that Whistler's character didn't entirely fit, as his arc was nonsensical. After a noble death in the first movie, Whistler is retroactively brought back, despite the fact that the explanation contradicts his character. Then Blade. Trinity kills him again, in a much less ceremonious fashion, marking the trilogy's most ridiculous character arc. Over the years since its release, the trilogy's place in the history of superhero cinema has become greatly overlooked. When rewatching the Blade movies, it's clear just how influential they were on the genre as a whole, making comic book adaptations seem incredibly cool, modern, and violent. With a firm handle on its unique sense of style, the Blade trilogy helped to mold the superhero movies that followed and undoubtedly will still influence Marvel's upcoming movies as well. The trilogy's pioneering role in the genre is easily overlooked, but rewatching the three films makes it clear once again. The final film in the trilogy, Blade, Trinity, is widely considered the worst. Where the first film offered a stylish introduction to Blade's world and the second expanded upon it with a horror-fueled action spectacle, Trinity fell decidedly short of the mark. It's perhaps the most unfortunate truth of the trilogy that its final installation was its greatest disappointment, and it meant that the arc ended on a particularly sour note. It's an unfortunately harsh reality, but the final chapter of the Blade trilogy was by far its worst, offering an underwhelming ending to the relatively short-lived franchise.